Hello! Today I would like to consider one of the most significant, but overall lesser discussed characters to appear in Final Fantasy VII. Now, Professor Hojo is only a small inclusion to the central story, appearing at intervals to propel the sci-fi elements forward, but taking a step back and looking at the entirety of the Final Fantasy VII story, and things that we don't necessarily see or play through during the contemporary events of the game, Hojo is a huge component of the events that transpire, and is a catalyst for the apocalyptic direction the world of Final Fantasy VII goes in, which has repercussions that echo out across the central story and beyond. Now, I mentioned in my original Final Fantasy VII review that Shinra is responsible for most of the bad stuff that happens in the world, and that they have negatively impacted several members of our central party, which spurs them into action. But we could further argue that it's under the umbrella of the Shinra Corporation and specific individuals in this company that actually perpetrate these heinous acts, with the tragedy of Barrett and Dine at Corel, for example, being specifically down to Scarlet's choices, rather than, this faceless corporation. By the same token, we can identify Hojo as a character directly responsible for some pretty heinous acts that created the dramatic circumstances from which the central characters emerge. And while Shinra gave him resources to conduct his research, it is down to Hojo specifically, who, unlike the more temperate Shinra scientist Professor Gast, had the inclination to pursue some pretty extreme and morally questionable experiments that severely screwed things up for everybody else in the party and the wider world. Indeed, just looking at how we are introduced to him in the game, we find Professor Hojo having taken Red XIII captive with the intent of breeding him with the last ancient, Aeris, in an effort to create an ancient with a longer lifespan, and thus a subject that can be experimented on for a longer period of time. And I always found an interesting, enduring mark of Hojo in the central party, being Red XIII, and this dehumanizing name and tattoo that this character sports, which endures where his original name, Nanaki, has been taken from him. And I think it's emblematic of how easily Hojo views sentient beings as subjects. And of course, digressing, Red XIII is a canonical but optional name in the original title, and I know that several people choose to call him Nanaki anyway, and also the way he rather dangerously says, "You can call me whatever you want," right before you name him, does invite some rather crude naming suggestions as well. But beyond Red XIII and turning to wider events and the impact of Professor Hojo, we have Aeris, and although Hojo has captured her in the contemporary events of the game, it's prudent to remember that he is responsible for capturing Aeris and her mother in the past as well. And he also murders her father, Professor Gast, in his efforts to experiment upon the ancients. And this is a neat bit of secondary story and exposition that's built up in certain locations, such as Professor Gast's diaries at the Icicle Inn, and Elmra's story of how she came to adopt Aeris early on in the game. So far we have Red XIII and Aeris, who Hojo has impacted, and once again, he proves a catalyst to tragedy in our central party by having orphaned Aeris, and he pursues her constantly, up into the events of Final Fantasy VII. Next we have, of course, Vincent Valentine, who was murdered, or at least mortally wounded by Hojo, and subjected once again to experimentation, which accounts for his longevity and unique beast-like limit breaks that we see in the game. And this is a story that is further explored in the spin-off title, Dirge of Cerberus, with particular attention given to the rather combative and awkward triangle between Vincent, Hojo, and Lucrecia, who is another quietly significant and tragic piece of the narrative puzzle that comprises Final Fantasy VII. And on the note of Lucrecia, and moving on to perhaps the most significant and successful experiment of Professor Hojo and his legacy, in the game, is of course the creation of the Jenova human hybrid Sephiroth, owing to his impregnation of Lucrecia and then injecting the fetus with Jenova cells. And as we know, Sephiroth goes on to become this unsurpassable hero who, upon learning the truth of his birth at Nibelheim, goes completely off the rails and enters a nihilistic black hole from which the world-shattering crisis and the summoning of Meteor occurs, which forms the backbone of Final Fantasy VII's second half. Additionally, as an offshoot of his Jenova research, Hojo correctly anticipates and perceives the Jenova Reunion theory, and one of his subjects in this area of study was of course our central hero, Cloud Strife, which leads up to the psychological decimation of our central hero and his inadvertent connection to the central antagonist Sephiroth, which of course again concerns a large part of the Final Fantasy VII story. So, from these few examples, we can see just how much this guy gets up to, and the heinous acts that he perpetrates in the name of scientific progress possibly builds a case for him being sort of a central antagonist, or at least a sleeper antagonist. Because after all, we've just covered that he directly impacts the lives of 4 out of our 9 central party members. And of course, he's created our central antagonist. So, it's very interesting to see how many of these core stories root back to Hojo and the actions that he's committed in the past. And I think the only thing that separates him from, a significant antagonist label is the fact that he's not actively trying to destroy the world or harm people in particular, but rather he's just a ruthlessly inquisitive scientist who inadvertently and doesn't care about the fact he leaves this trail of chaotic repercussions in his wake. Now, moving on and considering the characterization of Hojo, I think he's a remarkably well-delivered Final Fantasy VII character because he is responsible for so much of this stuff that's going on, and yet he remains quite aloof and elusive within the central story, which adds a certain mystique and intrigue about him. And indeed, I said a similar thing about Zack Fair in my Zack episode, and I think there is an argument that the extended universe material, such as Dirge of Cerberus and Crisis Core, expanded on characters that were interesting in the first place, precisely because we knew so little about them, and they retained this sort of enigma and enigmatic personality throughout the story. Looking at Hojo specifically, I think that his appearance in Dirge of Cerberus slightly skewed the amoral, impartial image of his character slightly, because it shows him as a much more actively antagonistic and vindictive, evil, I suppose, personality, which isn't really the impression that's painted of him in the original title. And as I say, he always struck me as a more uncaring and self-indulgent intellectual narcissist, rather than someone that would actively go around shooting people for the fun of it. And if we look at his several interactions with the central party during Final Fantasy VII, he's usually chastising them or mocking them, but he doesn't particularly care about them one way or the other, as long as they're not hindering him or his research in any way. And it's only really right at the end of the game that he seems to actually kind of take leave of his senses and actually become a boss fight. So, moving on, I think Hojo embodies a recurring motif that Final Fantasy games often address, which is this concept of nature versus technology, and how technology can often harm nature around it. The Shinra mining of Mako is, of course, a massive component of this as well, but I find that Hojo as an individual, his relentless push of scientific innovation and manipulation of the natural order of things, is an excellent avatar of technology and innovation that contrasts heavily with, for example, Bugenhagen of Cosmo Canyon, who, quite to the contrary, advocates the sanctity of the natural world and this harmonious, symbiotic relationship, of the planet and the life stream and the people. Hojo also departed in several ways from the technological industrialists that we often see in Final Fantasies, because rather than harnessing mist technology or constructing steampunk airships, he's very much the modern sci-fi definition of a scientist, complete with a lab coat and spectacles. And along with the alien Jenova, I think he is very emblematic of this push towards a modern dystopian fantasy setting that, much like its predecessor Final Fantasy VI, made Final Fantasy VII an increasingly radical departure from the earlier titles. And indeed, there's some interesting dialogue around Hojo that hints at this, such as when we stumble upon a materia fountain in Cloud's flashback, and Sephiroth comments that calling the substance a mysterious power would make someone he knows very angry, which is then revealed as Hojo, who Sephiroth goes on to describe as a walking mass of complexes. And it's this dismissal of mystery and magic in favour of logical absolutism that makes Hojo such an interesting yet menacing feature of the game, and so emblematic of this departure from the other titles. And his focus on genetics and human experimentation, injecting people with stuff just to see what happens, it conjures some pretty heinous real-world analogues, such as the Nazi doctors of World War II, Joseph Mengele and all that sort of thing. And this aspect of his character leads me on to my final interest about Hojo's character arc, and the unseen past events of Final Fantasy VII, which is how he contrasts to Professor Gast, who was his superior that he usurped and murdered. Now, where Hojo is this villainous narcissist who has a complete disregard for human life beyond its capacity for research, Professor Gast is a comparatively lesser seen character, but through dialogue and flashbacks is painted as a much wiser and more considerate man. And I think this contrast of good and bad is an excellent piece of exposition that helps amplify the villainy of Professor Hojo, particularly in the flashback where we see him actually ordering the murder of the professor just so he can kidnap his wife and his daughter. And the reason I think Professor Gast and Hojo are important is the legacy they leave behind in their respective research and storylines, namely through their respective offspring, which in many ways exemplifies their core characteristics and the measure of the men and their impact on the world. Sephiroth, who is Professor Hojo's son, is an unnatural, genetically altered production and a harbinger of death and destruction, which is embodied by his welding of the black materia. Aeris, on the other hand, who is the daughter of Professor Gast, is an ancestor and the last remaining member of the Ancients, who were identified by their spiritual oneness with the earth and the natural order of things, and Aeris as a bringer of light and life is embodied by her wielding of the restorative white materia. So this duality between Sephiroth and Aeris and the duality between Hojo and Gast was another observation I made during playing the game, and I really enjoyed it, and how the scientific dystopian angle echoes out from these two to create both the good and the bad aspects of the contemporary events of the story. And the argument as to whether Hojo is literally a mad scientist is also an interesting debate that kind of goes on in some communities, because he tends to fall back on logic in his discussions quite often, which hints that, he is a logical and pragmatic man. Yet, by the standards of what he does and how he utilises his logic, and certainly by the end of the game when he's actively trying to assist Sephiroth and injecting himself with Jenova, it's apparent that he has, become pretty unhinged. So, wrapping up on Hojo now, because I'm aware he is quite a minor character, a final point I'd like to make is his infrequent penchant for humour. And I'm not sure why, but I always found him quite an amusing character with this overblown narcissism and patronising nature when he's talking to people. And of course we see little cutaways, such as seeing him sunbathing surrounded by women at the Costa del Sol, which was unexpected and somewhat hilarious because it's so contrary to the image that we have built up of this character so far. And I really hope this is something that is hinted or at least shown in the remake as well. But again, this is just another great example of why Final Fantasy VII is so enduring and popular, because its characters aren't all morbid binaries who are unbendingly, stereotyped as their characters. And where Cloud Strife is messed up, but simultaneously often quite hilarious, and where we have Red XIII, who's quite a sombre, sincere character, but we see him trying to walk on hind legs, we also have Hojo, who is a ruthless scientist responsible for really awful things, but is still content to go and catch some rays, on the Costa del Sol, surrounded by women. So it's just another of those jarring and quite amusing appeals of Final Fantasy VII, I think. So, there we have it. That about wraps up my thoughts on Hojo. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. And if you enjoy the channel, please consider sharing on your social channels and subscribing if you haven't already.